This lesson is about writing the equation of a sinusoid when you're given a graph. Typically, we're going to look at these graphs and we're going to write them as cosines because it's a little bit easier to do than sines. This could also be written quite easily as a sine graph, but it's easier to do cosine. The first thing you need to know is the general formula for a cosine graph, and that would be y is equal to a cosine b times the quantity x minus c plus d. Okay, in this equation, a, actually the absolute value of a, is equal to the amplitude of the function. And the amplitude means how far above and below the baseline do you go. B is going to be equal to 2 pi over the period. And I'm just going to write PD for period. Okay, the period is how long does it take to complete one cycle, how long from a minimum to a minimum or a maximum to a maximum. And you could do it either of those two ways. C is going to be your horizontal phase shift. I'm going to abbreviate that HPS. And D is equal to your vertical shift, which I call in my classroom sometimes the baseline. The baseline would be represented by this dashed line. It's your vertical. It's how far vertically your graph is shifted off of the axis, off the x-axis. Okay, if I'm looking at this graph, I'm going to identify a few things here really quickly. I'm going to identify what is that line that I had just pointed to. Well, if you look, your maximum here is 18. Your minimum is -2. So that vertical shift or baseline has to be halfway in between those. So if you add those up and divide by 2, you will get the vertical shift or the baseline. So in this case, we have 8. Okay? With that in mind, it's really easy next to find what the amplitude is. To find the amplitude, you figure out how far above and below that 8 do you go to get to your maximum and minimum. Well, since my maximum is 18, 8 to get to 18, I have to move 10, or 8 to get to -2, which is my minimum, I have to go 10. So my amplitude here is 10. Okay? The next thing we want to do is figure out the period. Okay? If we look, I'm going to do this one from a minimum to a minimum. We could also do it from a maximum to a maximum. If we look here, if we start at this minimum, it takes us until we go from 4 to 44 to get to our next maximum. Okay, one thing really important here, this particular graph is in degrees, not radians. So 2 pi over b won't work for this one. We have to use 360 over the period. And I meant 2 pi over the period. Okay, so our period to go from 4 to 44 means we went 40 units, or 40 degrees. So we're going to do 360 degrees divided by 40 degrees, and that gives us 9. So our B is 9. Okay, since we started at this 4 degrees right here, we know our horizontal phase shift is 4. All right, since I have A, B, C, and D, or at least the absolute value of A, and then B, C, and D, I can write the equation for this sinusoid. Okay, that equation would be y equals, I'm going to leave A for a second so I can talk about it, cosine of 9 times x minus 4 plus 8. Okay, the reason I left A is because we have to determine, since we have the absolute value, do I use positive 10 or do I use negative 10? Since we're starting at a minimum, we would use negative 10. If we were starting at a maximum, we would use positive 10. Okay, that's one way to write the equation for this sinusoid. I'm going to also show you what we would have if we had gone from a maximum to a maximum and what would change here. So if I start here at -16 degrees and go to 24 degrees, that's from one maximum to the next maximum. Well, what's going to change in our equation? Our C is no longer 4. Our C is now negative 16. I don't like the equal sign there because 4 is definitely not equal to negative 16. So our horizontal phase shift is now 16. Our D doesn't change. Our baseline's still 8. Our amplitude is still 10. It's still, to go from negative 16 to 24 is 40 degrees, so B is still 9. So the only two things that change when we write the equation for this from maximum to maximum would be y equals positive 10, because we started at a maximum instead of a minimum now, cosine 9 x. Well, I'm going to subtract negative 16, so that's going to give me plus 16. Okay, the other thing I should do here, since this is in degrees, I should actually write my degree symbols on my 16 degrees and my 4 degrees. And there you have two equations for the same sinusoid. There are also more, but if you can find one, that's all you really need to do.